On this month's edition of Connect New York, we're exploring homelessness, and we'll try to understand the underlying causes, the short-term shelter needs, and the long-term solutions. All that coming up next on Connect New York.
This program is brought to you by the members of WCNY. Thank you.
Connect New York is sponsored by James Jordan Associates Architects, providing professional architectural services to educational, commercial, and institutional clients throughout New York State. James Jordan Associates Architects, with offices in Richfield Springs, New York.
Geddes Federal Savings and Loan offers home loans, IRAs, money market, checking, and savings accounts.
Geddes Federal, how can I help you this morning?
Personal service. Get it at Geddes. Offices in Westvale Plaza and in Manlius.
Welcome to Connect New York. I'm David Lombardo, host of WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, a daily public radio show broadcasting from the state capitol. On this month's episode, we're discussing homelessness with a focus on what leads to housing instability and the short and long-term responses to this societal problem. Later in the program, I'll be joined by a panel of voices to discuss those issues and more. But first, our producer, Alec Ambruso, took a look at some of the services being provided right here in central New York for the homeless. Here's that story.
Across the country, homelessness is multifaceted. People are experiencing homelessness from many different angles. And then in Syracuse, unfortunately, we've got really difficult winters. So it makes it a little bit more dangerous than it might be in other areas of the country. But it's, individuals that don't have a place to live, are struggling with either mental health, traumatic experiences, drug addiction, dependency issues. They kind of maybe burn every bridge that they had, and they end up at the rescue mission. Annually, we serve thousands of individuals. Some might just come for meals because we offer 3 meals a day, 365 days of the year. Some come for shelter services. We have several thousand people that come through every year needing shelter services. They just don't have a place to sleep. We also offer clothing. We provide people basic needs that they might have. And then we also operate our own housing units. And some of that is a continuation of shelter services where individuals need a next step up out of homelessness. So we have a limited number of housing units that we can access for people.
The 3 programs that we offer at In My Father's Kitchen are direct street outreach to the chronically homeless. Then it's our Higher Ground day labor program that's in partnership with Onondaga County. And that 3rd branch, it's called Lifehouse. It's helping women escape human trafficking and sex trafficking. So those are our 3 main branches, and they all revolve around folks living in homelessness. We're doing direct street outreach to the individual, so we're bringing everything to them in their places that they're living. So we're bringing a doctor to you. We're bringing advocacy to you. We're bringing food and supplies and clothing, the things that you would need to survive outside. And all those things we use as tool to build this relationship with you where you start to buy in and trust us and really start telling us the story as we're getting to visit you on a regular basis and then helping you navigate into the system. Higher Ground is a day labor program. It's an alternative to panhandling and a way to escape homelessness for the day. So we're using work now as another tool to get you on this van for 5 hours. So if I'm doing street outreach, it might be a 10, 15-minute engagement, but now you're on the van for 5 hours, right? You get breakfast, you get lunch, and then you get to work instead of begging for the day, so you're getting dignity through work. But there's 2 care managers embedded on the van doing care management, so advocating for them, helping them get their birth certificates or social security cards or calling other agencies while they're on that work van. And it's a way for them to escape the craziness of life for 5 hours and actually work and get money at the end of the day. So like right now, because it's getting cold, it's called Code Blue in our community. So once it gets 32 or lower, shelters relax the rules in regards to getting in there. So we help them understand that, hey, listen, you could go there. The rules are being lax so you can stay warm.
We have about 199 beds available, and throughout the winter months we'll have over 200 individuals coming in for the shelter services. Beds are always turning over, but when it gets really cold, we do just have people wait in the lobby. We can get people and make them pretty comfortable in the lobby, but for the most part we do have a good amount of beds as a network in our shelter system in Syracuse. As temperatures really change and temperatures really start dropping, it's dangerous. You know, it's more dangerous than for sure in the summer months. There's other things that make it dangerous as well. You know, when people are using drugs, you know, and overdoses are possible out in the middle of nowhere. That's always an annual concern all year long. But as the temperatures drop, they're not aware of how dangerous the situation can be. So our street outreach team is out there really trying to build relationships with individuals to try and convince them to come in from the cold. Also, our food service center is another way we connect with individuals. So by having 3 meals available for people to come in, get out of the cold, get warm, grab a meal, our staff are kind of aware of who's staying in the shelter and then who's just coming in for a meal. And then we try to press in on them a little bit more. So where are you staying right now? Or, you know, are you in need of a coat, shoes? Do you have enough underwear, things like that? And then some of those communications and some of those conversations turn into, yeah, I don't have a place to stay. And then we can kind of switch gears and see if we can talk to them into coming into the shelter. Public funding is essential to keeping all the shelter operations up and running. You know, I jokingly say that not-for-profits and organizations like ours, we do really essential work in the community to keep people safe, keep them off the streets. But then in our spare time, we have to fundraise to fill the gap. And I don't know any nonprofits that, you know, that don't have to fundraise. So, you know, it would be great to get to a point where the essential necessary services are fully funded in our community and really across the country. But we don't have that right now. So we have to fundraise to fill the gap in service needs, to be able to provide life-saving work that all nonprofits are doing all year long.
Our mission is to get private funded sources as well as resources coming into In My Father's Kitchen. So 60% of our funding source is private donors, but the other 40% is through government agencies, whether it's county government, city government, or the federal government. So we do our Higher Ground Work program is totally funded by Onondaga County, which is a blessing to us. The way that the community for us that can get involved with us is, unfortunately, we're a small agency, so we don't have volunteer opportunities. But for In My Father's Kitchen, I say we're always collecting gently used items, whatever season we're in. Right now, we're taking hats and gloves and scarves and coats and boots. They don't have to be new; they can be gently used, but as long as they're in good condition, we'll take them.
For sure, we can always use blankets and coats. Towels are always a really helpful thing when you know, you're out shopping. If you're getting yourself some new towels, it's always great to buy a couple extra towels and donate them to the rescue mission. Clients are always in need of like socks and underwear, basic necessities like that. We do tend to get a lot of you know, toiletry items, but deodorant. We always need deodorant as well. If it's cold out, if it's snowing, if you see somebody sitting on a bench and they don't seem like, or they've been there for a while, call 211. 211 is a great place to call and just give a tip like, hey, this person, I've seen them the last couple days, they keep doing the same thing. They might be out in the cold, you know, and then you can give that information to 211. 211 then connects with the local service providers, our street outreach team.
One of the things that I would love people to understand, it's somebody's family member outside. No one woke up one day and decided, I just want to be homeless. Things happen in your life that cause you to go down this road. So I want people to understand that these are human beings outside. They're someone's family member. And if it was your family member, would you want us reaching out to them? And of course the answer is yes.
It seems like pretty much the country, everybody is about 2 paychecks away from being homeless themselves. And so we are in a very fragile state where if you just keep working hard and don't have any issues, you're going to be okay. But if you have issues, medical issues, mental health issues, any type of addiction issues, you could spiral out of, you know, control pretty quickly.
If we all do our part and we understand that there's a human being in front of that's suffering and broken, they're just jammed up right now, we can help that person navigate out of that situation, and we've done that many times. But they're just people like everybody else.
And now we're going to hear from our panel, and joining me in the studio are State Senator Rachel May, a Syracuse Democrat, Megan Stewart, Director of the Housing and Homeless Coalition of Central New York, and Rebecca Zangen, Chief Policy Officer for the Supportive Housing Network of New York. So Megan, I want to start with you, and you have a regional perspective on this issue. And I'm curious, how does homelessness present itself? Because as opposed to the city of Syracuse, you have populations that are rural, urban, and suburban. So what are the different situations you're seeing?
Sure. So the Housing and Homeless Coalition is a 3-county coalition, which includes Onondaga, Oswego, and Cayuga County. So like you said, we run the gamut of rural homelessness, suburban homelessness, and urban homelessness. And I think a lot of what people typically think of when they think of someone experiencing homelessness is the person you see panhandling on the side of the road or someone sleeping outside in a city, but that's not the case. I would say a large majority of our population actually, when they are homeless, are in emergency shelters, whether that's congregate or non-congregate, in hotel motel situations, which is very common in our rural communities. Congregate sheltering is common in our cities. But really, it's not just a city issue. This presents itself in many different forms across our region. So I would, on any given night in our 3-county region, there's roughly 1,100 people sleeping without a stable place. And a majority of those folks are inside, and I think that's important for folks to recognize.
And what are some of the reasons that lead to housing instability with the population that you serve?
Yeah, homelessness is ultimately a lack of housing, more than it is anything else. We see folks who are facing eviction, staying with friends or family, and that relationship falls apart, or a property owner, landlord would no longer allow family to stay with family members under a lease. A lot of folks face substandard housing, housing that's not fit for human habitation, whether that's from issues like sewage, unfit situations, no heat in the winter, things like that, or lead. Families really, are just lacking a permanent place to call home.
Rebecca, you come at this from the guise of supportive housing, and we're going to talk more in the conversation about what supportive housing actually is, but can you talk to us first about the population that can benefit from supportive housing? Who are the people that might not necessarily be housing insecure because of financial issues, but because of broader concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Megan said, I totally agree. Homelessness is a housing problem. It's a lack of affordable housing. And that's the case for people that need supportive housing. But they also may need additional supports to maintain their housing stability. So it could be people with a disability like a serious mental illness or a substance use disorder, or a history of traumatic backgrounds like youth aging out of foster care, survivors of domestic violence, or veterans. And so what they need in addition to that stable place that they can afford is supports. And supportive housing provides individualized services to folks so that they can achieve their goals. It could look like coordinating transportation to medical appointments, making sure that people are current on their benefits, or helping them achieve like educational or employment goals. And sometimes it's as simple as connecting them back to their children and grandchildren. So the services in supportive housing really help to stabilize folks so that they can live long-term in the community.
So when it comes to homelessness, like any social services issue, there's a question of what the government's responsibility is. And we posed that question to State Senator Brian Kavanaugh, a Manhattan Democrat who chairs his chamber's committee on housing. Here's how he sees the state's responsibility.
So the Constitution in New York has been interpreted as providing a right to shelter. And that came out of court cases many years ago, and has only so far been applied in New York. The court case was a case against New York City, and the state participated in litigation. But the determination was that if you present yourself as needing shelter in New York, you have a right to shelter. That has been recently relitigated to some extent by the mayoral administration in New York with respect to new arrivals. And there's been some flexibility the city has had to sort of ask people to reapply for shelter if they are new arrivals, in a way that longer-term New York residents haven't been required to do for some years. But there is a right to shelter there. In theory, it's one state constitution, so that right might be applied in other localities, but so far it has not been.
So, Senator, we heard what your colleague has to say about the obligation at the state level. How do you think about the state's responsibility to address both, say, the short-term and long-term housing needs of the homeless?
Well, I agree with Senator Kavanaugh that we need to help people who just simply can't afford housing. The Housing Access Voucher Program is a really important one. There's an effort, they already do this in New York City, but statewide, to help people if they're facing eviction because they have missed the rent for a month or two. It's not very expensive to help people stay in their housing for those kinds of reasons. I think we have to remember that homelessness is not just a problem for the people who are experiencing it. It is a public health issue. It is a schools issue. It is an economic issue for all of us. Kids who are experiencing homelessness, they're not going to succeed in school. They are going to have all kinds of additional issues that they're going to bring to school with them if they come to school at all. And a neighborhood where a lot of people are having to move all the time or they're getting evicted is less safe because people don't know their neighbors. So it's a public safety issue too. Housing security should be a very high priority for us policy-wise because it's a good investment in helping individuals thrive, but also helping communities and neighborhoods and school districts and cities and rural areas thrive as well. So from my perspective, we need to take that approach that we need more housing, we need more affordable housing, we need more supportive housing, and we need to look at it as not handouts to individuals, but as something we do as a state because it is right for all the people of our state.
Well, as Senator Kavanaugh mentioned, this constitutional language has been tested in the New York City court system, but as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been sort of a challenge that examined the state's responsibility outside of New York City. So when you think about what the Constitution requires, do you feel like the state is doing enough to ensure that, say, municipalities aren't on the hook for providing short-term services?
Well, there's definitely more we can be doing as a state. I'm focused on just building more housing, making sure that we've got a supply of housing that can serve everybody who's looking for housing and help bring down the cost of housing, because right now, one of the big drivers, I think, and I think Megan will talk about this, that for the first time ever, the largest group of homelessness individuals in our area are families, not individuals. So that's about people not being able to afford a place to live or find an adequate, safe place to live. So we have to be really leaning into building more housing and renovating the housing that's out there now so that it's safe and livable. The supportive issue is obviously also critical, and I think we have to be doing all of that. I am more focused on just the supply of housing right now because I think it drives all of the other issues.
Well, Megan, then coming back to the idea of the government support, what kind of funding, if any, do you get from the local government, the state government, or even from Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, so there is investment, especially at the state level, into supportive housing that we haven't seen, at this increase, which has been great. I think what folks don't understand is in that short-term response, there is a lot of local taxpayer dollar wrapped up into ensuring people have a place to go. And outside of New York City, like you mentioned, where there is a right to shelter, that doesn't exist in the same way upstate. So there is the ability on districts at the county level to deny shelter to folks. And by that I mean emergency shelter. And as Senator May discussed, the way out of having to spend the exorbitant amount that is spent on sheltering by communities is permanent housing, which decreases the amount of time folks spend in that shelter, which ultimately is a huge cost burden to communities because there isn't blanket state investment into it or federal investment.
And when it comes to something like emergency shelter, do you see demonstrably different responses from the counties that you cover? For example, does Oneida County look at their responsibility different than Onondaga County?
There is a lot left to the county level. I will say that we have the great investment into sheltering here, especially in Onondaga County, where most folks who need emergency shelter are able to access that. But that can look very different in a rural community because they're relying on hotel motels, which is ultimately relying on the availability of hotel motels to be able to provide shelter. So families are having to cross county lines, school district lines to have a stable place to sleep at night. And then kids are having to get bused for hours to get to school. Absenteeism rises because of that. So it's just a very different picture between rural and urban communities, but ultimately homelessness is stressful, it's traumatic for families, and the amount of time we can lessen that folks have to experience that, the better.
So I want to stick with this idea of support for services that address homelessness, and specifically on the supportive housing front. And I want to return to our conversation with State Senate Housing Committee Chair Brian Kavanaugh, who addressed New York's support for these services. Here's a clip from that conversation.
We have increased in recent years the rate of production. There are about 62,000 or so supportive housing units throughout the state. They are usually built in new developments of housing. Some of the programs are scattered around in different units in different buildings where a service provider is providing services to all the residents. But that is those units are really effective at stabilizing people, providing the services they need. Again, these are people that need maybe some modest amount of services to stay stably housed. And we used to produce about 1,200 new units a year. We increased in the last 5-year capital plan, we increased the funding. So the state is funding 1,400 new units a year. The State Housing Agency, HCR, is very effectively, identifying providers that will build that housing and getting the money out the door. That is an area where I also think we should increase spending. If you're spending money to meet that demand and all of that money is getting spent, the odds are you could probably effectively build more of those units if you put some more capital up. It's primarily capital, but there also are operating subsidies that ensure that they have the money to provide the services that people need. And that's a very effective program. But again, we probably ought to be doing more of it.
So, Rebecca, we heard at the end of that clip from Senator Kavanaugh that we probably ought to be doing more in the vein of supporting supportive housing, something I imagine you agree with. So what does more at the state level look like when it comes to supportive housing? Is it about investing in the capital needs so that the construction can be built, or is it more about the operating needs? How do you see this problem being solved moving forward?
Well, thanks for the question. And, Senator Kavanaugh mentioned we have 62,000 units of supportive housing across the state, and that's in every county of the state. So I want to really emphasize to the viewers that it's not just a downstate thing, it's not just an urban thing. Same with homelessness. The solution to homelessness, supportive housing or permanent housing, is all over the state and looks different. And Senator Kavanaugh mentioned about half of our supportive housing is when nonprofits are finding apartments in the community, renting them on the private market and bringing services into the community for tenants. And about half of them are in kind of purpose-built housing that's either newly constructed or renovated for the purpose of providing supportive housing with services on site. And as Senator Kavanaugh mentioned, the state is in the middle of a 15-year initiative to develop 20,000 units across the state of supportive housing. And as he said, it's been a very effective program, and it's driving production in all regions of our state. Everything, we all know, has been getting more expensive. So what it cost to operate the program in 2016, right now in 2024, moving into 2025, we've all seen the cost of groceries has gone up so much in the last couple of years. The cost of constructing housing has absolutely gone up, and operating that housing. So doubling down and investing in that new production, I think, is really important because we see there's more people that need it. But I also want to point to kind of our first generation of supportive housing. So supportive housing actually was created here in New York State. We are the trailblazers that states and communities across the country have replicated. And so in 1987, the state created the first supportive housing program that provided services in the housing context to address chronic homelessness and people with those service needs. And it's been incredibly successful. We know that supportive housing works. We have data that shows that over 90% of people that move into supportive housing, they're going to maintain their housing stability over the long term. We have data that shows that it's cost saving, right? So Megan spoke about the cost of emergency shelter, especially spending on hotels and motels. We're going to save money there. We're going to save money spending in hospitals and emergency rooms and jails and prisons. So we know that it's a really effective model, and we've been doing it for decades. But we do have some supportive housing that really haven't seen increases in the rate of contracts since the 1980s. So we know that it works, but we need the funding to be able to both upgrade these buildings. Some of them, the buildings themselves might be over 100 years old, and they were only lightly renovated in the 80s and 90s to become supportive housing. So they need new roofs, they need new boilers, they need elevators, and they have folks that have aged in place and need to be able to get in and out of their apartments in wheelchairs. So we need that capital funding for the first generation of supportive housing, and we also need the services to help keep up with the needs of those tenants. We know many of them, as I said, have aged in place. We have some data showing 65% of those tenants are older adults. So we need services 24/7 in these buildings, and again, things that will help people stabilize and maintain their independence in the community. So we've identified about 9,000 of these first-generation supportive housing units that are really at risk due to severe underfunding. And we are hoping that the governor can address that in her budget in January. And we have legislative champions as well that we really appreciate. Senator Clear just pre-filed a bill yesterday called the Supportive Housing Modernization Act. So I'll agree with Senator Kavanaugh. We absolutely need to continue developing and building more supportive housing, and the state needs to double down on its original supportive housing and increase funding to make sure that those can stay as resources in our community.
So just to flesh out something you said there, are you saying that the programs that have been around longer essentially get less money to operate the services than the more recently established programs? And if that is the case, is there anything different in terms of what the older programs provide in terms of services that might warrant them getting less money?
So you're absolutely right. Yes, the older programs are getting significantly less funding than the newer programs. And there really is no difference to the folks, the profile of the tenants that they're serving. And so we have nonprofits that are just scraping and scrounging. I should have mentioned supportive housing is their government contracts to nonprofit service providers to operate the housing. And so, one of our members in New York City did a financial analysis and showed that this first generation supportive housing contract that they have to provide housing for survivors of domestic violence is only providing $5 an hour for them to pay their staff. So this nonprofit has to scrape and scrounge to just pay staff a living wage. It's very challenging.
Senator, when you think about the way to address this, are there any forms of low-hanging fruit? Because obviously capital means money you can borrow, and borrowing's just always creating a problem for the future, so that's easy to do, I guess. Or is operating aid easier because maybe that's less money in the short term? How do you think about the state's ability to address the demand for supportive housing?
Yeah, well, in my experience, it's easier to get the capital money than to get the operating money, because operating money is not a one-time thing. It's
Pay as
going
you
to
go,
keep
those
coming
recurring
back
costs,
every year.
yeah.
But also, I think we also have to think about the continuum. Like when I was the chair of aging, I worked really hard on the naturally occurring retirement community concept, which also started here in New York. And the idea was lots of people moved into a big high-rise apartment building when it was built, and then they stayed and aged in place. And if you turned that building into effectively an assisted living situation for all these elderly people, they wouldn't have to move out. And it's those dislocations that can lead to housing insecurity, housing, and eventually even homelessness. So trying to invest in a lot of different systems of helping people stay in their homes, whether at different levels of support that people might need in those homes is really important. I also want to lift up here in Syracuse, we have this not-for-profit called A Tiny Home for Good that started out as finding supportive housing for homeless veterans. And there was a lot of research done and indication that homeless veterans really didn't want, by and large, congregate housing. So having individual homes that they could live in was a much more likely way to get them long-term solutions to homelessness. And so they built a lot of tiny homes on formerly vacant lots in Syracuse with supportive housing for initially for veterans. I think now they've expanded to beyond veterans, but I think there are different populations that need different kinds of housing as well. So really making sure that we're thinking that through and not just one size fits all kind of housing for people experiencing homelessness. It's a very broad range of types of people. We were hearing about people in rural areas who might be in a mobile home of some kind, but that doesn't have power, and it's or they're squatting in somebody's barn or something like that. So what kinds of housing you need in different areas of the state? That's a big question too.
Megan, in terms of the ability to actually build new supports for the homeless, whether it is supportive housing or emergency shelter, we can sometimes hear about pushback from local communities. And I'm curious what your experience has been in central New York. Have communities been willing to embrace these services in their own backyard, so to speak, or have you faced that kind of NIMBYism that we hear about all over New York, including in my own hometown of Saratoga Springs?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges with this investment into affordable housing is it's almost become a dirty word in a lot of communities, that they don't want an unknown population coming into their community and living there. It's really rooted in a lot of misconceptions of homelessness. It exists in almost, I think, everywhere. We've tried to advocate for supportive housing or affordable housing to be built. It's faced with backlash from, I would say, a few angry voices of the not in my backyard. But really, I think what we've tried to demonstrate today, we've all touched on, is that this isn't an urban issue. This isn't, isolated to cities across the state. Is people are experiencing homelessness everywhere. People in every community across the state could benefit from affordable housing. And that can be in one of, a wealthier neighborhood. There are still people who live in that neighborhood, who want to live in that neighborhood, who could benefit from affordable housing. And I just think all of our neighbors, everyone in this community should be able to choose where they want to live, and that is just not afforded to everyone right now.
Can I jump in on that? Yeah, I just want to echo what Megan is saying, that it's a huge challenge to developing new supportive housing. And Senator Kavanaugh spoke to the state producing up to 1,400 units a year. addressing community pushback is really one of the things that's constraining our ability to produce as much supportive housing as we need. And I think we need to do a much better job at educating people and breaking down that misinformation and that stigma. We talked about what supportive housing is. We need to do that more and make it plain. And I also think that, Senator May just spoke about taking vacant lots and building tiny homes. But supportive housing, if people see it, they can see that in many cases you are taking a vacant lot or a blighted building and you're turning it into something beautiful that includes community amenities. So we need to do a better job at being ambassadors in the community. And I am encouraged to see, we hear a lot about NIMBY, not in my backyard. Those people aren't necessarily the majority, but they are very loud. And I am encouraged to see movements for people who are saying yes in my backyard in places like Long Island and Westchester. And so I think we all need to contribute to that conversation more.
And Rebecca, what about getting buy-in from the population that might benefit from supportive housing? Because I have to imagine there are some people who see this as an important lifeline to helping them get their lives on track, and then there are other people who might balk at the idea of going into this sort of program. And I'm curious, how do you engage with those people who might potentially benefit from supportive housing but aren't necessarily embracing it? And are coercive tactics ever the right way to get people into supportive housing?
Coercive tactics are absolutely not the right way. And one of the things that's really important to note about supportive housing is the services are optional. So it's not an institutional setting. You're a tenant like any other tenant in the community. Those services are individualized, they're built for you, and you can choose to engage in whatever way makes the most sense for you. And sometimes it takes a while for the tenants to build trust with the people that are working in the building, providing services to them. That's why we need to invest in those staff so that they can stay and continue to work in those programs and build those relationships with tenants. When you're making minimum wage doing a job like this, that's very challenging. There's a lot of turnover. This is a calling for people, right? But you can't continue to work in this field if you can't make ends meet. Right. So it's really important for us to make sure that staff is supportive housing. This is an equity issue. It's predominantly women and women of color that are the human service workers providing support in supportive housing. And so we need to make sure that they're really getting paid what they deserve and can continue to have a long-term career. That then helps the tenants because they're staying there for the long term and developing that trust and relationship. But as I said, coercion is absolutely not the best strategy. And the quality of the services is really what entices people to participate.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, I really have not found in all of my years of working in housing people being resistant to going into housing. They're getting beautiful apartments, they're getting services when they want to engage in them. Really, that's not what folks are resistant to. And I think our community has done a good job. Our providers have done an excellent job of making sure that they're safe places, they're meeting people's needs. And yeah, that's really just not a point of resistance, I think. I think supportive housing feels like coming home for folks at the end of the day.
What about in emergency shelters? We occasionally hear that there are facilities that might have strings attached for you to utilize them. Do you think that's ever the right way to approach this type of emergency support?
I think definitely not. I think we need to meet people where they're at when they're in an emergency situation. Just like you wouldn't deny emergency room care to someone who's if they're, actively using substances or have untreated mental health. There's no reason for us to then also deny emergency shelter when they don't have a place to sleep. We've seen a lot of success locally with what's called low barrier shelter, where there aren't those preconditions on sobriety. There's not preconditions on service engagement. And it works. And Syracuse has historically had very low numbers of people sleeping outside. And that is directly attributed to having low barrier shelter options that are, housing focused and meeting people's needs.
Well, for some people, the only barrier to stable housing is the cost of that housing. And to that end, there are efforts to create a recurring state voucher, which would help subsidize rents for eligible New Yorkers. We talked about this idea with State Senate Housing Committee Chair Brian Kavanaugh, who's been leading the push for this in Albany. Here's what he had to say about this issue.
I've been pushing since the latter part of 2019 for a large-scale rental assistance program that would be statewide and would be modeled on the federal Section 8 program. Section 8 is a program that will pay the difference between 30% of somebody's income and the fair market rent for an apartment in their area. And that has been very effective at stabilizing, thousands and thousands of families in New York, millions throughout the country. But there's always a very long waiting list for those vouchers. And I think the state could step in and augment that program. And so we've proposed this program called Housing Access Vouchers. And that program would basically provide a state-funded voucher. We would run it through the same system that provides Section 8 vouchers. So it'd be easy to get it up and running. And I think it would be very promptly effective at diminishing homelessness and also stabilizing people. One of the problems, there are people that they struggle to pay their rent for a long time, and then they lose their home and they become homeless. Many other people may struggle for a very long time, but often they're struggling to pay 40 or 50% of their income in rent. And that kind of rent poverty, even if it doesn't lead to homelessness, is really destructive. So that's a program that really would address a lot of our housing problems statewide. And again, both houses of the legislature have pushed for it, and we've been continuing to negotiate with the executive branch to get that implemented.
So, Senator May, the program that your colleague referenced is one of those rare issues in Albany where there is support from groups that might be diametrically opposed on other issues. So what do you see as the potential for the Housing Access Voucher program, and what kind of investment are you going to be looking for as part of the budget negotiations in 2025?
Yeah, I don't know the number that we're going to be asking for, but it isn't a huge amount of money. But it really, if you can keep people in housing and the landlords get paid, everybody's, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
So we do want to make sure that we can make that happen because, but as I said before, stable housing is a public good. We all need that to happen. I think it'll be complicated because some of the rents that are being charged now are really, I don't know if you would call them fair market rents. And so for trying to figure out how you're paying a reasonable rent, with those state dollars would be an important piece of that puzzle. And that's part of why it's hard to pin down an exact number that we're going to be asking for. But I do think extending that program much more broadly would help a lot, together with, as I mentioned, the something that would help people if they have a rent arrears and they're facing eviction because of 1 or 2 months of rent that they haven't paid. Making an investment in that, just keeping them in their houses. I think, there are a lot of other ways to support tenants, and we've been working on a number of those things. I think that the passage of the good cause eviction last year, many communities have been adopting that now, and one of the things that does is kind of rein in some of the extreme increases in rent, which then makes it easier to pay for something like a housing access voucher.
Yeah, and I think the number that's been thrown around in the past was about $250 million annually. Megan, we often hear about the cost of rent as a New York City issue, but here in Syracuse, I know that this is a problem. So when you think about something like the Housing Access Voucher Program, do you think subsidizing the cost of rent could make a real difference in ensuring that people have stable housing?
Yeah, absolutely. We consider in the housing world vouchers kind of the golden ticket to get you out of homelessness, to get you stably housed, and it could make such a difference in rehousing folks. I do think, as Senator May mentioned, there are concerns with there's no regulation of the market to force property owners to keep rents at fair market rent, to accept a voucher, which is part of a voucher system. But really it would make such a difference in keeping people stably housed. And I think not just stably housed, but in neighborhoods of opportunity, in neighborhoods of choice, because vouchers aren't in set places. Folks can really choose where they want to live. They can build community where they want to live. And really that'll help with deconcentrating poverty. And it just gives economic opportunity to folks to breathe a little easier, be able to save, be able to invest in themselves, knowing that they're not significantly rent burdened as so many tenants are here. And just to go back to good cause eviction, we are really grateful that it was passed at the state level. We are really encouraging our municipalities to opt into it as they have to, because it really will keep tenants stably housed. Which, when we look at homelessness here locally, we saw a significant decrease in homelessness when we had the eviction moratorium, eviction protections in place during COVID-19. Once those were lifted, homelessness increased dramatically, 60% year over year in our region. Family homelessness has increased 192% in 5 years. We need to focus on that prevention, on keeping people housed as much as we can.
Sticking with the Syracuse area, Megan, there's a lot going on right here. We've got the plan for Micron in the area, which is going to bring a lot of people to the community, which could put more demand on the housing market. But as we mentioned, there's the good cause measure, I think that recently passed through the Syracuse local government, which could present some limitations on what landlords can charge. There's also efforts to change the zoning here to make housing production easier to do. So when you think about what's happening locally, is there reason to believe that the housing picture is going in the right direction?
I think it depends. I do think, if with the passing of good cause, it would make a huge difference to stability for tenants. But I do think that we do not have the production to keep up with housing demand right now. If we have an influx in a big population increase, that'll only stretch the market thinner. And what happens is the folks who are at the bottom rung of that ladder are the ones who lose out, who are the ones who are going to potentially face homelessness or housing instability, who might not have had that issue previously.
And let me just say, we're working on a lot of fronts to try to increase housing production. Right. I'm introducing a bill for a revolving loan fund, so that just to bring down the cost of financing construction so that we can build more housing and build it reasonably affordably. We are working in Syracuse on trying to adopt the model that they've got in Montgomery County, Maryland, where there's a municipal housing development system. So it's a not-for-profit development system where they build really nice housing that people really want to live in, and they are able to make it mixed income and a real engine for growth and bringing people into that community. I just think looking on ways to make it less burdensome to build the housing in the first place is a policy issue that we have to address in New York State, and I've been working on that a lot.
When I think about things that might increase costs, there's a variety of policies being kicked around in Albany, some that are scheduled to take effect, like the requirement of electrification of homes in the future. Then there are some that are still kind of being bandied about, like sprinkler systems in new housing. How do state policymakers need to balance those mandates that might improve public lives but also could increase costs?
I mean, we have to balance them. I hear you, and I definitely feel like right now the emphasis has got to be on building more. We can't just set safety aside, but the more we can build. I have a a bill to kind of change how the environmental review is done on buildings if they are being built in for affordability in places that have public transportation, infill development. That right now the environmental review just invites all kinds of lawsuits that drive the cost of development way, way, way up. And I think, thinking a little differently about what we mean by environmental review and say, it's environmentally positive if we're building in those places as opposed to building more sprawl development way outside the cities and that kind of thing. So, thinking a little bit differently about how we permit some of this construction is also important.
Rebecca, we've got a change in leadership in Washington, D.C. that's scheduled to take effect in 2025, and I'm curious whether the Republican trifecta there or other, unforeseen changes that could happen in 2025 and beyond are something that you're bracing for as it pertains to the development of supportive housing or just the continuation of the operations that are already ongoing.
Absolutely. It's such an important question. I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what's going to happen in 2025, but we can look to the first Trump administration. We can look to think tanks that are aligned with Trump and some of the things that they're proposing. And so I would say the risks are from a funding perspective and also from a policy perspective. So from a funding perspective, we've spoken a lot about how critical housing vouchers are to helping people maintain their housing and get out of homelessness or just stay in a community where housing prices are high and wages haven't increased. So the federal housing rental assistance, commonly known as Section 8, $3 billion of that funding comes into New York State every year. And so there is a risk if that funding gets cut that we're going to see some people who are benefiting from that funding actually fall into homelessness. The last time that this budget was slashed in the Reagan administration, we absolutely saw a spike in homelessness. The other source of federal funding that we receive that's really important is homeless assistance grants. So New York State gets $300 million of homeless assistance grants, and primarily that goes to funding permanent supportive housing. So if we lose that funding, we absolutely have, some of those 62,000 units that we currently have across the state would be at risk of shutting down. It's very serious. So New York, I think, really needs to step up. I mentioned the first supportive housing program was created in New York State in 1987 during the Reagan administration as a response to the modern homeless crisis. So New York needs to continue to be a leader here and double down on its commitment, in face of what could be coming out of Washington. Just from the policy perspective, there's a real concern right now with criminalizing homelessness. So the Supreme Court, with the justices that Trump appointed in his first administration, came to a decision this year on Grants Pass case, which is a community in Oregon, which essentially allows communities to outlaw sleeping in public even when there is no shelter bed available in that community. And so we're seeing, as a result of that Supreme Court case, a lot of local communities, municipalities across the state starting to consider bills or issue policies that will further criminalize people. Now, we know that this is absolutely not a solution to the homelessness problem. People will be cycling in and out of the streets, the shelter systems, jails, and hospitals. And we know supportive housing is the solution to that. So, I know Megan can speak more to this, but it's absolutely something we're keeping an eye on and making sure that New York stays true to its values and what it's been doing for decades that works.
Well, Megan, we actually only have about a minute before we have to go, so I want to give you a chance to solicit some contributions right now, because I imagine you're always looking for support. So if people do want to help the work that you do in Central New York, what's the best way for them to support your cause?
Yeah, I think one of the most critical things is to be an advocate for affordable housing and supportive housing development in your community. If you want to get involved in the coalition, we are open to new membership. So if folks are looking for ways to get involved, they can visit our website and volunteer with us or support the work of the coalition as they see fit.
I imagine you're taking straight cash too, right?
Oh, always.
Sounds good. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. My thanks to our panelists, State Senator Rachel May, a Syracuse Democrat, Megan Stewart, Director of the Housing and Homeless Coalition of Central New York, and Rebecca Zangin, Chief Policy Officer for the Supportive Housing Network of New York. And to check out our entire interview with State Senate Housing Committee Chair Brian Kavanaugh, or dig into past episodes of Connect New York, visit WCNY.org/Connect New York. And for more political coverage, including our conversations with State Senator Rachel May, check out the Capitol Press Room at capitolpressroom.org or wherever you download podcasts. On behalf of the entire team at WCNY, I'm David Lombardo. Thanks for watching.
This program is brought to you by the members of WCNY. Thank you.
Connect New York is sponsored by James Jordan Associates Architects, providing professional architectural services to educational, commercial, and institutional clients throughout New York State. James Jordan Associates Architects, with offices in Richfield Springs, New York.
Geddes Federal Savings and Loan offers home loans, IRAs, money market, checking, and savings accounts.
Geddes Federal, how can I help you this morning?
Personal service. Get it at Geddes. Offices in Westvale Plaza and in Manlius.